Welcome to Love and Abuse, the show about navigating the difficult relationship. From simple disagreements to emotionally abusive behaviors, you deserve respect and kindness. All the information on this show is meant for educational purposes only. Always seek a professional for your mental health and well-being, and always pick your battles wisely. I'm your host, Paul Coliani. Welcome to another episode of Love and Abuse. I am so glad that you are here, and I also want to do my best to help you through whatever you're going through, whatever challenge you're dealing with in a relationship. So if you've not heard this show before, that's what I'm here to help you do and to help you get through. Today we have a challenge that I'm going to read to you. Somebody wrote and said, I am so grateful to have found your page. I am desperate for help. Please, I'm deeply in love with an emotionally abusive man who is tortured by emotional pain, but he doesn't see the ways he is creating that pain by hurting me and others. He is estranged from his children and he has failed other relationships, but will not see that he is the common denominator. Like you, he grew up with an alcoholic dad who he described as anger was the only emotion he expressed. It is tragic. This man is so kind-hearted, but also twisted. I see his pain. I see that he suffered abuse, thus abuses me. What I don't know is how to approach this with him. Please help. We are nearing the end of our relationship if we don't make progress. I'm going to see a therapist, but I don't know how much longer I can last. Okay, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, that's a challenging situation when you know someone has gone through their own suffering, their own trauma, and they're still dealing with it. It's still maybe PTSD with them. They have issues that they need to work through. We love people, but they have trouble loving us in a healthy way, and this happens a lot. So the first thing I want you to do is listen to the episode of Love and Abuse called, Is There an Easy Way to Help Someone Understand They're Being Emotionally Abusive? Listen to that episode. It's going to help you. It's going to give you the tools and the ways to communicate that will help you share that message with him. So that is your first step. And then the second step is to remember, and I actually may say this in that episode, but remember that it's not his past you're dealing with. It's not his trauma. It's not his pain. You're not dealing with that. You're dealing with his behavior toward you. And that's all you should focus on. We've all had some challenges in our past, and I'm not minimizing his, and I'm not invalidating what he went through or what anybody went through. Everyone has experienced their own versions of suffering, of trauma. And even if you don't think you've had any trauma, there's always something. There's always something in our past. And some people get lucky. Some people don't experience that. They have a great upbringing. They have healthy boundaries. They've gone through any healing if they needed it. And they're fine. They're doing great. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about people that have actually gone through some type of suffering and they still need to heal from their past, whatever happened in their past. So we're going to meet people like this. We're going to be in relationships with people like this. And their suffering is real. Their trauma is real. Their PTSD is real. And it's theirs. That is theirs to work through, to heal. Not that you can't help. Not that you can't be there and listen to them. But it's still theirs. It's still their trauma, their pain, their suffering. And again, you can be there to listen. You can be there to have them bounce stuff off of you, and they can ask for your tips or your advice or whatever. That's all good. But you have to treat the behavior toward you as a separate thing. It has to be separate. Otherwise, you will mix in their trauma with yours. You will mix in their past abuse, their past neglect with whatever's going on today. And as soon as you do that, I hate to say this, you will lose. There's no win. That's a no-win situation. You will lose in the sense that you will not gain any ground. you will be stuck. You'll be stuck, and you will be limited to the extent that they've healed from their past. And again, I know it's all intertwined. Their past is intertwined with their present, and it's their current thoughts about their past, or the way they cope with their past and how they cope with their emotional triggers today. It's all intertwined with their past. It's all because of their past. Yet what you're dealing with is their behavior toward you, and what they're dealing with, if they can't stop that from happening, if they can't heal from that, then they might need to seek some help. And like you said, he doesn't see that he is the common denominator for all these problems. I'll tell you what happened to me. I was the same way. I lost at least 4 really good relationships because I didn't realize that I was the common denominator for the problems in the relationship. For those who've never heard this show, I used to be emotionally abusive. I used to be critical. I used to be judgmental. I used to make my partner feel guilty. I used to give them the silent treatment and withhold love. Awful things. Awful, awful things. I always feel a hint of embarrassment when I have to say that, but it's true. And I think it's important for you to know this because I can see these behaviors in others and I know how to get past them. I know how to heal from them. I know what you will lose if you don't. If the person doesn't heal from these things, they will continue to lose relationships. And I also know it took 4 relationships for me to figure it out. And it took someone standing up for themselves and saying, I can't take it anymore. I don't want to be with you anymore. It took that for that to happen to me over and over again, and for those events to occur in my life for the compound effect of what was really happening. And that's what, let me break that down. What I mean is that sometimes we can't figure out what the problem is until the problem is in our face over and over and over again. And then suddenly we realize, oh, that's the problem. That's what I had to go through. I had to realize I was the problem. But I couldn't have realized that had the relationship continued. And I'm not saying that it's necessary to break up or separate or get a divorce. I'm saying that that's how a lot of people have to learn, is that they have to lose something that's important to them. They have to lose it because as long as the relationship continues, they don't believe it's bad enough, their behavior is bad enough to stop. And I know people who have listened to the show for a while, they've heard me say that over and over again. The emotionally abusive person might say, obviously my behavior is not bad enough because you're still here. And so that puts the other person in a tough position, because what does that mean? Does that mean leaving? Does that mean separating? Does that mean divorcing? Does that mean that you have to do something drastic in order for them to change their behavior? I think the latter applies. You do have to do something drastic in order for them to change their behavior. They have to realize that what they're doing is causing you to lose love and to lose the ability to tolerate anymore, because you can only tolerate so much. That might be what you have to say to someone for them to finally decide to get help. That might be what you have to say. I can't tolerate anymore. I can't do it. I can't move forward like this because you are still hurting me. You hurt me today. You hurt me yesterday. You said this to me. This is where I get into specifics about their behavior. When you want to share how someone is emotionally abusing you, don't say, you're emotionally abusing me. Don't leave it in a big bucket that could be filled with almost anything. Emotional abuse is a big bucket. But do say exactly what they're doing and how it makes you feel. When you do this, I feel hurt. When you say this, it makes me feel like you don't love me. When you say this in front of my friends, it makes me feel like you don't respect me. Be specific. Again, that episode that I mentioned earlier, my actually say these things. I forget what I said on that episode, but I think it's important to reiterate it here, even if you've heard this before. Because if you decide to say, hey, you're being abusive, or hey, you're narcissistic, or anything that is a high level category that is a bucket that you can put a lot of behaviors in, then that is the wrong direction. You want to get to the lowest level component of that category. If you think they're a narcissist, then find a specific behavior that they do that hurts you, that bothers you, and share that when they do that behavior, it does this to you. It causes you to feel hurt, causes you to feel unloved, disrespected, embarrassed. Share that. I mean, if you feel safe, always pick your battles wisely. But if you want to try to tell somebody that what they're doing is harmful, you don't want to leave it in a big picture category like, hey, what you're doing is harmful. You want to say what you just did right now. That's what I'm talking about. When you do that, it hurts me. And so that's how you share a message like that. If somebody is hurting you and you're not sure how to share that, again, listen to that episode and also heed these words, because that is the way to get to the very specific behaviors that you want to change. If you say you're being emotionally abusive, or you're a narcissist, or you're a sociopath, or whatever it is, that's probably not going to go over well. And this is also something that can backfire. If you say you're an emotionally abusive person, it could backfire, because all they have to do is say, well, you're an emotionally abusive person too. What do you do with that? Now you're on the defense again. You have to be specific about the behavior. So that's my first part of the answer that I want to give this person, or anyone listening that needs to hear this. You want to make sure that you cite specific behavior so that you have something to talk about, so that it's tangible. Let's put this behavior on the table. Let's talk about it. Now, let's say they don't change. Now, this is evidence, right? You say, when you do this, it hurts me, and they don't change that behavior. That is when you have to accept that they know they're hurting you and they're still doing it. When you share what hurts you, what you feel disrespected by, what makes you feel unloved, when you share that and you've told them exactly what they're doing to make you feel that way, and they do it again, then they're doing it knowingly. They're doing it consciously. It doesn't mean they're not being triggered unconsciously, but the very first thing that needs to change in an emotionally abusive relationship is the behavior. This is what I teach in Healed Being. The very first thing is the behavior needs to stop. If you yell at someone all the time, if you're emotionally abusive and you yell at someone all the time, you have to stop yelling. I know it might be hard. People get triggered and they yell, but you have to stop the very front line of the emotionally abusive behavior, which could be the yelling. If you are the person that gives the silent treatment to withhold love, you have to stop. It's a really simple request. It's very difficult to do for the emotionally abusive person that has done it all their life. I'm going to tell you right now, it is very difficult, coming from that place myself, to stop being who you've been for your pretty much entire life. But it's necessary. And believe me, if there's a threat about the end of the relationship, unless you change, you're going to see change. And if you don't, then it doesn't sound like that person really wants to save the relationship, or really believes that you're going to follow through with whatever you plan on doing. But the emotionally abusive person has to know that their behaviors have to stop, or they will be accountable for that. They will be responsible for what happens next. Unfortunately, a lot of them won't take responsibility for what happens next. Part of the emotionally abusive cycle is that when you do something that honors you and is a good, healthy step for you, they will criticize it and blame you for doing something bad or rotten. I mean, that is one component of emotional abuse. This can happen, is that you can take a step that's good for you, that's healthy for you, and even healthy for them. You taking a step for you, honoring yourself, is also healthy for them. It shows them how to treat you right. It shows them how to treat you or love you in a healthy way. So you are giving them a gift by honoring yourself. Sometimes they need that gift. Sometimes they need to know what your boundaries are. Sometimes they need to know what is important to you. Well, they always need to know that, but sometimes they need to be reminded. So when you remind them of your boundaries, of what's important to you, of how you want to be treated, it is a beautiful gift you can give to someone to help them stop the behaviors. Because someone who loves you is going to do the best they can to stop the behaviors that hurt you and go against those things that are important to you. If they don't stop, then they are knowingly hurting you. They have to stop the behavior. So to the person who wrote, let's just say that you shared all this. You've shared the details. You've shared the specific components of what hurt you and what makes you feel bad and the abusive behavior, but you're calling out the specific behaviors and he still doesn't stop. What do you do then? Again, we're treating the behaviors toward you separately from his pain, his trauma, because those are things that he does need to heal from and deal with, but he needs to do it with somebody that isn't part of the emotionally abusive cycle that is created in that relationship. He needs to do it with somebody that knows how to help him. I'm not saying he can't read books and watch videos and reflect and meditate and journal. I'm not saying he can't do any of that. He can. If that's what helps him, if that's what helps him change, great, more power to him. But if that's not helping, he might need to reach out to someone else. He might need to seek something or someone. I have an entire comprehensive program that helps people change from being emotionally abusive. But I never push it on anyone, and I actually don't recommend the victim of emotional abuse pushing it on anyone. The abuser has to want to stop abusing. The hurtful person has to want to stop hurting. They have their own stuff to deal with, and they need to stop hurting. I don't mean inside, I mean outside, out toward people. They have to stop hurting other people. And they have to heal inside. But the very first step, stop hurting people you care about, or at least the people you say you care about, because you need to love them in a healthy way. You need to support them in a healthy way. You need to show them that you care by not doing behaviors that show them that you don't. Those behaviors are selfish. They're controlling. They're hurtful. And yes, they do originate from your own trauma, your own poor coping mechanisms that you developed as a kid, or survival mechanisms that you developed. And as you grew up, those coping mechanisms stayed the same and they were never developed. And now you have the same ones you did as a kid. And when you were a kid, if you were in any type of trauma or abuse, you need to learn how to deal with it from an adult perspective instead of from a child's perspective. Because that's really what happens, is that emotionally abusive people will rely on old coping mechanisms. I mean, they're not doing this consciously. This is just what happens. They'll rely on old childhood coping mechanisms to react and respond. And unfortunately, that doesn't work when you're an adult. I mean, if the coping mechanisms are unhealthy, it won't work as an adult. Because coping mechanisms are for that child to survive when they're created. Only for that child, typically. It isn't for anyone else. It's just for that person. Coping mechanisms are developed for a self-serving purpose. They serve you and you alone, typically. So when you develop a coping mechanism to deal with some challenge or trauma or neglect or abuse when you're a child, it is made for you. You developed it for you so you could survive the moment. And then when you grow up and you don't address those coping mechanisms anymore, and you handle the same types of challenges or similar challenges that make you feel the same way, if you handle them the same way you did as a child, then you still have old childhood coping mechanisms that are running your life. That's almost always what happens with emotionally abusive people, is that they will have childhood coping mechanisms running their life, because that's how they cope. If they cope by lashing out to push people away, and that helps build a wall of protection between the both of you, then that's what they'll do. That's what they've done, and that's what they'll do today. If they don't want to feel vulnerable, if they don't want to cry, if they don't want to express, if they want to avoid feeling anything too deep or too painful, then one of those old childhood coping mechanisms will come up, and that is their default. That is what they always default to when they are in a challenging situation. So if they don't stop hurting you, if they don't stop the outward behaviors towards you, the last step of this process is accepting that they won't. That is the unfortunate truth. If they realize that what they're doing is hurting you because you've pointed out the specific behaviors and you've tried and you've invested into the relationship, and I know we invest so deeply into these relationships, and we try to save them, and we try to work through them, and we try to see the best in them, and we try to remember that they were once better than this. But if they're not showing it, that's who they are today. That's who they're showing up as. And that is probably who they've been ever since you met. And they had the ability to control it before. They had the ability, they had the choice to control it before, because most people don't get into a relationship and the first day they're emotionally abused and that relationship continues, because it's immediate. It's like, oh, this is who you are. Oh, I don't want any of that. So I better leave this relationship. They'll know that it's time to leave because they saw the abusive behavior and they don't like it and they don't want to deal with it. But what ends up happening is that a lot of emotionally abusive people don't show up like that at first. They show their best side, which proves that in most cases it is a choice. Now, there are caveats to that. I talk about conscious manipulators and unconscious manipulators, which is basically saying there are people that consciously choose to hurt you and they know they're doing it. And then there are people that don't choose to hurt you, but they just react. It's like a fight or flight. They just react. That doesn't mean that they're an inherently bad person. In fact, this is what I see more often than not, is that what started off to be a great relationship and that person showed up in so many wonderful ways, they started reacting unconsciously. They started letting their guard down and shutting down their filters and being more comfortable around the person that they're with, and just started behaving in ways that were a surprise and awful and hurtful. And so what ends up happening in that relationship is that, let's just say it's a romantic relationship, the person fell in love, like you fell in love with an emotionally abusive person, and it was great for the first 2, 4, 6 months, first year, maybe 3 years. It was a while, but then you started seeing behaviors and you didn't like them, but because they were treating you nice and they were showing up in a great way, maybe it's not them, maybe it's you. You start taking responsibility, you start taking the blame, you start feeling guilty, and all these behaviors start coming out of them. And because you're so invested in the relationship and committed to the relationship, you stick around hoping that they'll change, or maybe you will adapt or change yourself and show up in ways that you believe are better or healthier and will bring happiness to the relationship. But no matter what you do, you can't change them. You can't change who they are and maybe who they've always been, but they were making different decisions at the beginning of the relationship because they didn't feel as comfortable being themselves at first, or they really were trying to pull one over your eyes, unfortunately, and show you somebody that they aren't. Because that's what happens. They show up in a way that seems like everything is wonderful, and then a few months later, typically, when things start to settle down, the honeymoon period is over, then you start to see behaviors that surprise you in a bad way. They're not good. So it could be a number of months, it could be a number of years, but eventually, if those qualities are in them, they will come out. And so coming back to this person's email, yes, you have to come to an acceptance that this is how he treats you, and you have to choose if you're going to allow yourself to be treated that way from this point on. And I promise you, I'm not trying to blame the victim here. I'm not trying to make it your fault for staying in a situation. We all have different reasons that we stay. And sometimes we have no choice but to stay. Sometimes we have to stay in a situation that does not benefit us and even harms us because of our resources, because of where we are in life. And sometimes we have to tolerate it until we get to a better place in life. All I'm saying is that it's important to understand that the behavior you see, once they realize that they're hurting you and they don't stop, you have to accept that they won't stop. You have to accept that even though you're crying, even though you're suffering, even though you feel bad, they won't stop. And once you accept that, then you are prepared to make the next best decision for you. That might be planning your exit. That might be speaking your truth, saying, I've had enough. If you don't stop, I'm going to sleep in the other room for permanently, or I'm going to move in with my sister, whatever it is. But if you don't get to the point of acceptance that this person will not change, then you may not do anything. You may stay in a situation hoping they'll change and waiting for them to change, but how much more evidence do you need? I know this may not be what some people want to hear. This may not be what the person who wrote the letter wants to hear. To the person who wrote the message to me, again, I know this is a tough situation, but the most important point that I'm going to reiterate now is to separate his pain, his trauma, his suffering from yours. You have your own challenges to deal with, and you need to deal with them. Just like he has his own challenges to deal with, and he needs to deal with them. If your challenge is how he treats you, then that's what you need to deal with. And I'm going to make this point. You're not his therapist. You're not his coach. You're not his guide. You are his support system. You are there for emotional support. You are there to care for him. You are there to do whatever you can to help him through certain situations. But with emotional trauma and PTSD and emotional triggers, that's not your job. I mean, I'm being a little bit assertive now. That's not your job. You shouldn't have to deal with that because you have your own stuff. If you were perfectly healed, if you really were a therapist, if you could separate your challenges, your issues, your emotional stuff from his and show up as a very present person, ready to listen, ready to hear judgmental things about you. And when he shared, he was able to share everything without your interjection saying, that's not true. Or, why are you telling me that? Why didn't you tell me this before? You know, all the personal reactions that we have when somebody shares something about us or talks about us. If you are able to be present with him and be non-judgmental and separate your personal from the ability to support him in a therapeutic way, then I would say, sure, go for it. I mean, it's not easy. I think you have to have a special set of tools to do that. And there are some people that can do it. I've been able to do it myself. But in the context of an emotionally abusive relationship, having one person trying to help the other, it can fall apart quickly, and it sometimes even makes it worse because the person trying to help the other one is already dealing with their own stuff. The emotionally abusive person is dealing with their own stuff, and the victim of that emotional abuse is dealing with their own stuff, and it's very hard to show up for somebody when you have your own stuff. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying it's very hard, especially when it's just those two people and they're in a romantic relationship or a very close relationship, because all of your stuff is mixed together. It's intertwined. And this is what I mean by intertwining your issues and your challenges with his past. When you start mixing those things together, you get some very toxic cocktails that will not be beneficial to the relationship and may even damage one or both of you going forward, because you can't be enough for both you and the other person. I hope something I've said today has been helpful. The person who wrote is in a very challenging situation, I know, and a lot of people that are listening to this show are in challenging situations. So this is kind of a give it to you straight episode. I mean, I always do that, but I want to make sure that you understand what it might take to get through something like this. And again, if you don't have the resources to take the big steps that you need to take now, and you want to take big steps, you might have to plan for those steps. And sometimes it's important to accept that you really can't do anything at all. Sometimes you just can't do anything about what's going on. And that's another level of acceptance that once you get to that point, you might realize you have to make different decisions for yourself and those you care about. I hope this helps. Share this with others that might benefit. Love and Abuse is the official podcast of the Mean Workbook, an assessment and healing guide for difficult relationships. The workbook gives you your mean score, which tells you the exact behaviors causing you to leave so many interactions feeling bad. Now you can pinpoint the specific unhealthy and even toxic behaviors in your relationship to help you take the next best steps for you and those you care about. Visit loveandabuse.com for more information. If you've discovered that you are doing the hurtful behaviors to someone you care about and you would like to change that about yourself, sign up for the Healed Being program over at healedbeing.com. The course comes with a private online group where I and others will give you direct support. You'd be amazed how good you feel when you are able to stop making those you love feel bad. That's healedbeing.com. And if you're looking for a safer way to listen to this show where all the titles to the episodes are changed, for those peering eyes, click on the Safe Listening button on the podcast page over at loveandabuse.com. This show exists to remind you that you are not alone and you're not going crazy. You deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. You deserve honesty and sincerity. You deserve to be treated as worthy and significant because you are. We'll talk again soon.